Chapter 9. Macapa, Brazil. Vera couldn't resist. She moved up behind the big Austrian, where he stood checking gauges in the wheelhouse, and ran her hand lightly across his firm buttocks. It went with the warm breeze, the clear blue water, the salty air, and diesel oil. "Can I help you, Miss Fillmore?" Dieter asked, without turning around. "How did you know it was me?" she asked, sounding mildly surprised. "I don't think it's something Arnie or Joe would do, ma'am." She laughed, and he continued. "Besides, I recognized your perfume." "I hope you like it, Wolf," she said, moving around him to look at his face. "I have it made specially for myself." "Very pretty," he said. She caught a glint of blue from his sidelong glance. "Very feminine." Vera preened. She hadn't made as much progress with him as she'd hoped to, and by the end of next week, or sooner, they'd be in San Diego. "I didn't think you'd noticed," she said with a pout. He turned to smile at her. "Of course I did." Vera felt her heart flip-flop, something that happened more rarely now, but was very welcome when it did. It was time to move into high gear. "I've been meaning to find the time to get acquainted with you," she said. "I like to know my crew, since we're under one another's feet all the time. If you're free, I'd love for you to have dinner with me tonight." Dieter's face showed his surprise when he turned to her. "I'd be honored." What else could he say? He'd wanted to get some time to talk to her alone, see if she was a suitable recruit. He just didn't want things to get personal. Unfortunately, Vera Fillmore was the kind of woman who liked to take things personally. Suddenly, and unusually, von Rossbach had the feeling that he was in over his head. 8 o'clock then, Vera said happily. Then, with an alarmingly direct look, she added, "Try to be very hungry." "Oh, God," Dieter muttered as she sauntered off. "That was wonderful," Dieter said. "Even better than in the crew's galley." Vera chuckled and gestured to her maid, who brought her a mahogany box. Pursing her lips judiciously, Vera chose a cigar, neatly trimmed the end with a cutter she took from the box, and lit it with a candle. She indicated Dieter with a nod of her head, and the maid brought the box to him. "Cuban," his boss said, exhaling a fragrant cloud of smoke. "And the best of the best at that. Do you enjoy a good cigar, Wolf?" "When it's something special, yes." Dieter selected and trimmed a cigar for himself, took a long, deep drag, and leaned back, letting the smoke out in a long plume. The lighting was intimate, and the windows wrapped around the seating area at the stern showed a view of a nearly full moon over the ocean. Vera rose, and Dieter stood with her. "Let's have our brandy in the lounge," she suggested. "Why don't you pour, dear?" "Uh-oh. We're up to endearments already." It wasn't that he would object to having sex with her. It was that he thought sex might screw things up. He wanted to recruit Fillmore, to use her money to lay by the caches of food and weapons they'd need after Judgment Day, and her influence in high places, and her mobility. For this to work right, it needed to be a genuine commitment to the cause on her part, not something she was doing for romantic reasons. There were no reasons in the world more likely to cause vicious feelings once the bloom was off the rose. He brought the brandy to her, pleased that she hadn't asked him to warm it for her. There was a contraption on the bar, but he wasn't in the mood to mess around with something flammable right now. Dieter handed her the balloon goblet and took a seat on the couch opposite. She gave him a rueful smile and said, "I know who you are, you know." Dieter froze. "Pardon me?" Tossing back her head, she giggled like a girl. "You're Dieter von Rossbach. We have friends in common. Though you've been off the scene for a very long time now. Actually," she put her drink down on the side table, "I only recall seeing you in the society column of Town and Country. There are several events that we both are supposed to have attended, only you weren't there. I assure you I would have noticed if you were." She sucked delicately at her cigar, waiting for his reaction. But von Rossbach just sat there, wearing a grim expression, ignoring the brandy in his hand. "So why," she continued, "are you playing deckhand on my little boat?" Vera settled back, taking another puff of her cigar, and watched him through the smoke. Taking a puff of his own cigar, Dieter regarded her. It was easy to forget that Vera wasn't just a bubble-headed blonde. She liked to laugh, disdained formality, and had an earthy sense of humor. But she'd also made most of her fortune herself and was utterly independent. "I wasn't actually ready to talk to you about that," he admitted, not least because he wasn't sure how to go about convincing her that what he said was true. "Well, I am." Vera shrugged and looked away. "You're hardly the first good-looking guy to get aboard my yacht under an assumed name. You're just the first one that was rich. You could have your own yacht. You could have your own deckhands. You don't have to be one." "So, what's your story, von Rossbach?" "What do you think it is?" he countered. She tapped her cigar into a crystal ashtray, watching the rich ash flake off as she spoke. "Well, I think that you want to sneak into the US, and for some reason you expect to be stopped at the border." She looked up at him, smiling. "How'd I do?" He pulled the corners of his mouth down and shrugged. "You're dead on, Vera. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I had Arnie check your stuff, so I know you're not carrying contraband. And I may be kidding myself, but I don't think any of my regular guys is being your mule. So, why do you need to go sneaking around? Can we get to the point here?" "Well, here's the problem." He paused, wincing. "My story is so unbelievable, I'm kind of afraid you'll throw me overboard when I'm through." "Oh, don't worry, honey," she assured him. "If I don't like your story, Mexico beckons." She took a sip of her brandy. Start talking. Where were you all those years we were supposed to be partying together? I was doing something else. Dieter began to unbutton his shirt, and Vera's eyebrows shot up, her eyes widening and a little smile unconsciously curving her lips. When he slipped off his shirt, the first thing she noticed was how muscular his torso was. Although not quite the standard gym muscle man type. More functional, graceful, despite its thick, muscled solidity. A thrill shot through her as she wondered if he meant to seduce her. Then she saw the scars. Holy shit, she whispered. What the hell happened to you? Dieter smiled. He couldn't help but be pleased by her reaction. In a distant corner of his mind, he wondered how Sarah would react. This one. He pointed to what looked like a second navel, placed 4 inches to the side of his real one. Is a bullet wound. I got that in Beirut. This. His finger touched a crescent-shaped scar on his arm. Was a knife. One of those curved Arab jobs. Here. He finally got to the one that really intrigued her. Is where a guy named Abdul El-Rahman tried to carve his initials. I killed him before he could finish. Sometimes these guys get so involved they forget they're not immortal. So what? You were some kind of soldier of fortune? Vera shifted a little nervously. This was not the way she had imagined the conversation going. No. Dieter took a sip of brandy. I was a covert anti-terrorist operative. Now I'm a soldier of fortune. He smiled at her. A very romantic designation, don't you think? She smiled in answer, a slight blush painting her cheek. Blinking rapidly, she took another sip of brandy herself. So, what do you want? She asked. Dieter took a deep breath, and her eyes fastened on his chest. She forced herself to look him in the eye. Maybe you should... She gestured vaguely. He knew what she meant and was happy to oblige, putting his shirt back on. Right now, I just want to get into the US. He tipped a hand left and right. Under the wire, so to speak. I had hoped to perhaps gain your sponsorship of a mission of some importance. Secretly, Vera had always daydreamed about somebody coming into her life and tapping her for some desperate mission. Of course, she was no fool. From time to time, people had tried to manipulate her, tried to get her to support some drug deal or vicious tyrant in the making. But she had resources that the average millionaire didn't have. Over the years, she'd built up a network of friends and information gatherers who could give her the inside story on almost anyone. Von Rossbach, oddly enough, was pretty much a mystery to them. Though they all said that he had a rep as a stand-up guy. Vera sat forward slowly, her eyes glowing with excitement. Tell me, she demanded. When he was finished, Vera looked away, her eyes thoughtful. Then her glance went back to him. So, all you want is to stop this one project. He nodded. But there are forces at work here that really believe in this project, and they have friends at the highest level. I have friends at the highest level, she said confidently. She smiled. I could have a talk with them. Dieter shook his head, his face sad. No, this project is so black that the people you know probably aren't aware of it yet. A look of impatience crossed her still pretty face. So how much do you want? How much will you give me? 2 million, he said aloud. For a start. Whoa, well you don't want much, do you? She said. You're rich, so why don't you kick in? My entire fortune is dedicated to stopping this project. He shrugged self-deprecatingly. All I ask is that you consider it. Vera took a deep drag on her cigar, studying him with narrowed eyes through the smoke. She tightened her lips. All I have is your word on this. That's right, he agreed. And you don't know me very well, so you don't know that my word is good. But I don't know you well either. And these are very secret matters. Until and unless you commit to this project, I'm not at liberty to tell you more. As I said, think about it. Consult with your friends about me. I only ask that you not mention what I've told you. It could be dangerous for you and for them. What about you? She asked, arching a well-shaped brow. Smiling ruefully, he shook his head. I'm in so deep, I consider myself lost at sea. Vera snorted, then bit her lip. All right, she said at last. I'll consider it. She raised a finger. No promises, understand? He raised his glass in salute. I've asked for nothing more. Vera returned from her business appointment feeling depressed and thoughtful. The South American side of her affairs was doing all right, but hardly spectacularly well. And she was disappointed. Maybe it was time to do some pruning of her investments. She leaned against the yacht's railing and sighed. It wasn't just business that had her down. The whole thing with Rossbach Ingolfsson certainly hadn't lived up to her daydreams. She got so sick of people hitting her up for cash for this or that project. Though, with his money, von Rossbach hardly needed to do that. Which made his appeal for money somewhat puzzling. Though the appeal of those shoulders and that chest. Vera sighed again, this time in pleasure at the memory. 2 million, That was a lot to pay for just a peek. She could tell by the way she was thinking that he was going to have to go begging for his money to somebody else. I do so hate being used, she thought, pouting. On the deck below, a pair of hands grasped the railing, followed by von Rossbach. Vera stood back and stayed very still, watching as he came over the rail, soaking wet and... He's naked, Vera thought in disbelief. She suppressed a laugh, watching as he looked all around, confident that he couldn't see her. She'd had this balcony at the back of her private quarters constructed so that she could see the deck below while being hidden herself. There was something odd about von Rossbach, besides his being stark naked, but she couldn't put her finger on it. He finally moved off. I have got to call him on this, she thought. If they were going to be cited for public nudity by the local police, she'd be the one to be blamed and ticketed. She had some standards after all. The last thing she wanted was the reputation of running a floating brothel. She hurried out of her quarters, meaning to catch up with him. Vera smiled as she imagined the expression on his face as she gave him a dressing down, while he stood there, beautifully undressed. The Terminator moved down the short, narrow corridor on its way to the crew quarters. The design of this yacht, with the exception of the owner's quarters, which were customized, had been on the builder's website, so it knew the layout of the ship. After observing the boat for 2 days, it could also identify everyone on it. One of those humans was Dieter von Rossbach. The I-950 had affirmed the request to terminate. Hearing voices coming from the stairway leading to the engine room, it pushed the volume on its microphones to high and hastened to the end of the corridor. The T-101 flattened itself against the bulkhead and peered around the corner, looking down the stairs. A man turned at the door of the engine room and leaned in.
"I'll be back,"
the one called Arnie shouted.
"Don't be too long."
Voice recognition software confirmed that the second speaker was von Rossbach. This was excellent. As it listened to Arnie's footsteps moving down the corridor, it could hear only one other set of footsteps within the engine room. Its quarry was alone. There was a violent clash of machinery from the engine room, and it lowered its volume to protect the sensitive auditory device. Then it moved quickly down the stairs. Dieter was wishing the engine room were air-conditioned. His body was covered in oil and sweat, and only a drenched headband kept it from stinging his eyes. The captain had decided that while they had a few days, they should perform basic maintenance on the yacht's engines. Essentially, a tune-up with an oil change on a massive scale. Von Rossbach assumed he wanted it done here because local regulations about used oil were a lot less strict than they were in San Diego. Right now, he was steam cleaning the engine and resenting Arnie taking off, leaving him to, literally, take the heat. He grabbed the handle that would move the crankshaft and leave another area accessible. The Terminator found a box of tools beside the door and pulled a 2-foot-long pry bar out of it. As it had neither gun nor knife, this should do for a weapon. Though it should be able to destroy an unarmed human with its bare hands, mission parameters stated that any and every available advantage should be used. The soft clatter of machinery being manually cranked, succeeded by a sound like a compressed air blast, led it to its prey. Dieter sprayed the upper part of the engine with the steam, watching the muck run off with a sense of satisfaction. He was almost done with this. It had been a long time since he'd pulled maintenance on a marine diesel, and it made him feel nostalgic in a way. Another half hour or so, and he'd be able to go up on deck for some of the comparatively cooler air there. Then a shower. He imagined the shower stall would look something like the engine did now, with black goo running down its sides. He squatted to get to the lower side, and a pry bar hit the engine with enough force to dent the metal. Dieter fell onto his butt and reacted instinctively, turning the steam jet on his attacker. There was no scream of pain, and the figure, dimly seen through the steam, didn't stagger back. Instead, the bar came down for another blow. Dieter rolled to his knees and shoved at the man while he was overbalanced to make his strike, and his opponent went down. The Austrian rose to his feet and stared at the man, astonished to see that he was naked. Then the man turned over and began to rise, the pry bar still in his hand, and... "That is my own face." Red and covered with blisters, the eyes white and peeling from the steam blast, but still terrifyingly familiar. The Terminator reached up and plucked the cooked flesh from its eye sockets, revealing the red lights and black plastic of its eyes, and allowing it to see. "Oh shit," von Rossbach said, and turned, running for the door. He needed a weapon. Something in the way of high explosives would be nice. The Terminator's hand flashed out, and the hooked end of the pry bar locked around Dieter's ankle, bringing him crashing to the metal floor. The Austrian scrabbled forward, reaching for the toolbox, intending to throw it. Then the pry bar hit his thigh glancingly, and von Rossbach shouted with pain and went down again. His hand reached out and came up with a 5-pound sledgehammer. Dieter rolled onto his back just in time to block a blow from the pry bar, aimed at his neck. The force of it was shocking, slamming the head of the hammer into the slatted grillwork of the engine room deck. "I'm going to die," he thought, as the Terminator raised the bar for an impaling stroke. Vera heard someone cry out, and she hurried down the narrow stairway, listening with alarm to what sounded like a fight. She arrived in the hatchway just in time to see the Terminator place its foot on Dieter's injured thigh, causing him to cry out again. She shouted, "No!" as she saw the pry bar come up for a blow, and the Terminator turned towards her. For Vera, everything stopped in that moment. Sound, breath, thought. A terribly burned face in which blazed red, glowing eyes turned towards her, hesitated. Then the Terminator began to bring the bar down towards the man on the deck. Dieter swung the hammer, knocking the bar out of the Terminator's hand, then brought it down on the T-101's knee. It crumpled, and at that moment Vera realized that the sound was metallic. As it adjusted its leg, von Rossbach rolled free, coming up against the bulkhead, seeming to rise to his feet in one fluid motion. He grabbed the power cables that had been rigged to test the engine and hit the switch with his elbow as the Terminator lunged towards him, its big hands reaching for his throat. Dieter pushed the live cables into its reaching hands, and the Terminator almost flew backward to lie twitching on the deck. Instantly, von Rossbach scrabbled to the wall, took up an electric arc welder, and went to work on the twitching, recumbent form. He didn't have much time until it reset. Vera sank to the deck with a little cry, her eyes so wide the whites showed all around, her hand to her mouth in horror. Ignoring her, von Rossbach cut through the metal neck bone analog, watching with grim satisfaction as the red lights behind the thing's eyes went out. Then he stood panting for a moment before he turned his attention to the frightened woman in the doorway. "It isn't human," he said to her. She looked up at him, uncomprehending. Dieter knelt beside her and spoke very gently. "Look," he said, pointing. "You can see the metal. It wasn't a person." She looked at the fallen Terminator, then turned to von Rossbach and back again. "Not human," she said, her voice shaking. "Are you all right?" Dieter asked her. He hoped she wouldn't go into shock. "Do you know who I am?" Slowly, Vera frowned. She was shocked and badly frightened, but she was also very tough. "Of course I know who you are. I'm not an idiot. What the hell is that thing? Why does it look like you, and how the hell are we going to get rid of that body?" He leaned back and studied her, assessing her condition, and decided that she was going to be all right. As all right as anyone was after meeting their first Terminator anyway. "It's a Terminator," he explained. "Its mission was to kill me in order to protect that AI program that I told you about." Dieter watched her as her eyes turned to the fallen Terminator. Its skull showed metallic gleams through the mass of crushed flesh, and the spine was a mass of gleaming, cut metal and sparking wires. She licked her lips and then looked up at him. "How did it know where to find you?" she asked. Then she straightened with a gasp as an idea struck her. "Are there others?" She grew pale. "Could there be another one on the ship, I mean, right now?" He laid a gentle hand on her shoulder and shook his head. "It's unlikely that there are more around right now. They're not all that common. As to how it found me," he shook his head, "I don't know. It probably picked up something on the internet and came looking." Vera shuddered and turned away from the Terminator, burying her head on his shoulder. She began to shake. "Oh God," she said. Dieter put his arms around her and let her rest for a moment, but then he urged her to rise. "I'll dispose of this," he said, planning how he would do it even as he reassured her. "You should go and have a brandy and lie down. I'll come and talk to you later." "Don't," she said, rising to her feet, her face determinedly turned away from the Terminator. "I need to be alone." She walked away like an old woman, and Dieter watched her, frowning, uncertain what to do. His options were limited. Stay and risk her turning him away, or go on his own. He didn't think that she'd mention the Terminator to anyone. She was intelligent enough to imagine the consequences of that. Dieter looked at his disposal problem and decided to stay. With such unequivocal proof presenting itself to her, she just might come through for him.